Joining us at the start of November was the new Cruiser Tier 7 Atago. With the 35-day event nearing its end, it's time to decide whether or not you want to pay out the rest of the event or if it's just one you're going to pass up. With that said, let's get right into it, Let's start with the first thing at the top of the list there, survivability. With 40k health, it's definitely not one of the healthiest ships out there, and with up to 127mm armor, also fairly thin armor. Now this is a cruiser, so you're not going to be wanting to spend time brawling with people at close range. Next, let's move on down the list to artillery. The Atago has 5 turrets, 3 on the front, 2 aft. Both are, or rather all 5, are 2 guns each. Now with a range of roughly 16 kilometers, which you can increase, and actually a pretty good turret traverse time for Japanese cruisers, and a reload time of roughly 16 seconds. Actually, you're on the higher end of what may be considered a heavy cruiser, but with only 203mm shells, you will mostly be relying on your high explosive rounds to do your damage. Hopefully it set fires, especially considering your armor piercing rounds actually don't do a whole lot more damage than your high explosive rounds, so you'll be relying mostly on those shells. Now, as you can see here in the picture above as well, you have 4 turrets of 2 guns each for secondaries, but you definitely wouldn't want to rely on those. That's too few to be effective in any way. As for the dispersion on your 203mm turrets, I found them to be quite tightly packed, so very reliable for hitting targets even at longer ranges, which is definitely what you want to stick to on this one. Now let's move on to the torpedoes for the Atago, which is actually one of its stronger suits, boasting launchers of 4 tubes each. That's 2 on the left, 2 on the right, at a range of 10 kilometers. 4, you're definitely going to want to watch your corners when there is an Atago roaming around, and this does give you a lot of options. Though you may want to stay at a longer range when firing your artillery, you'll definitely want to make use of all the islands and corners and options to fire your torpedoes that do up to 17,000 damage roughly at a range of 10 kilometers. 62 knots doesn't mean a whole lot until you use them in game, but that's not a slow torpedo and they go quite far. So this is definitely where you're going to rack up a lot of kills and a lot of damage, more so than the fires with your primary cannons. As we move down the list here, we do pass over the anti-air defenses. It may be worth noting for future that the Atago actually has a lot of anti-air defense, should they add carriers to the game. Future to Legends, it will be a very good ship to have around to help deal with all those pesky planes. Which brings us down to maneuverability. Now, the Atago is quite a fast cruiser, leaving a speed of almost 37 knots, and actually has a surprisingly good rally turning radius on her that lets you get in and turn around in what I found to be actually surprising circumstances. Now, this leads to the fact that the Atago is actually a very heavy torpedo-focused cruiser. And so with very good torpedoes, you have a lot of options with your maneuverability to turn around to get the most out of your torpedoes. So I found it's actually, as you can see in the footage here, turning around in a surprisingly small area there, which allowed me to get into exactly where I wanted to be. Which brings us down to the last section here for concealment. Now, with a concealment of just below 12 kilometers, the Atago is actually a very good ship for hit and run tactics, given that your range of your main cannons is going to be over 16 kilometers. So I found in my play it's very easy to fire a few volleys of shells at ships, and then very easy again to drop off their radar, move a little bit, switch your position, and even for getting fairly close to torpedo range. Now, your torpedo range is only going to be about 10 kilometers, but that's not a huge distance if you're able to drop it in front of them. and given that you actually have a fairly good speed of just over 36 knots on the Atago, it's actually not that hard to stay undetected while using both your torpedoes and your primary cannons for most of the match. And that pretty much sums things up. Now, I found that I very much enjoyed my time with Atago so far, but the note here I've noticed is that the Atago is not going to top the damage numbers in any way unless you really manage to land some torpedoes. But generally speaking, using your main cannons for the first few minutes of the match, you're only going to be running a supporting role, mostly setting fires. You're not going to be able to hit citadels very easily from any safe range. Once you're getting in closer to that 10-kilometer range, they're just going to tear you apart since you're thinly armored. You're relying mostly on your mobility here, and as mentioned, your concealment is actually pretty great, so you should make use of that when you can. With that said, very fun ship. I highly recommend it. Maybe it's not for everybody, but it seems to last, sit down exactly where I like to sit. A little bit of a support, but dangerous in close quarters. As long as you play it, like any ship, intelligently, you'll have a good time with it. And now that we've touched on everything, I thank you for watching.